If Mount Angel had the equivalent of the Guinness Book of Records, Paul Grandi would go down in it for having the earliest capstone presentation. By about a month, I would say. I think probably the soonest we've ever done it in the semester was at the end of March or April. So Paul, once again, is a trendsetter. So welcome Paul, please, for his capstone.
Welcome everybody, thank you all for coming to my capstone presentation entitled The Tales That Really Matter, J.R.R. Tolkien and the Legitimacy and Importance of the Genre of Fantasy. And before I begin my presentation, I'd like to acknowledge certain people who helped guide me throughout the capstone process, helping me to avoid certain pitfalls and really ensuring that this capstone was the best that I could write. So first of all, I'd like to thank my capstone committee, Dr. Creighton Lindsay, my director, Mr. Mark Woolman, my reader, and Dr. Mark Van Ness, my English Standards reader, all of whom proved to be an invaluable help to me with their experience. I'd also like to thank Philip Shiflett, who, as a writing assistant, spent several hours reading my drafts, contributing not only to the grammatical correctness of my paper, but also to its content and structure. Finally, I'd like to thank my former diocesan brother, Jesus Sanchez, for the several hours we spent conversing about our capstones in his room. He really forced me to strengthen and clarify my arguments and overall contributed to the quality of my thought that's presented in this capstone. So, the subject of this capstone is the literary genre of fantasy. And it's really a genre that not many people take seriously, especially in academic and adult circles. For example, in 1996, Waterstones, which is kind of the equivalent of our Barnes & Noble or a Borders or something like that, a big book-selling chain in Britain, conducted a poll of 25,000 readers in Britain, asking them what they considered to be the very best book of the century. And the #1 answer was not any of the literary classics that you might expect, like 1984 or To Kill a Mockingbird or Ulysses, but was instead, with over 5,000 votes, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings trilogy. This absolutely horrified the intellectual elite of Britain. They considered it to be a black day for British culture. They could not fathom how a book featuring imaginary worlds and imaginary characters that is basically mere childish escapism could have such a hold on the hearts of the British public, and that thought really depressed them. And as a lifelong reader of fantasy myself, I've encountered these attitudes several times in my own life. People have always said to me, oh, fantasy, that's just childish, you know? It's just for people who can't handle reality, and so they have to escape from it in, a cowardly and immature fashion. And really, it's just a waste of time. It's just, you could better spend your time reading real books about the real world, and, it'd be a much more productive use of your time. And I have to admit that as I grew older, it began to be harder and harder to justify my continued enjoyment of these fantastic worlds that I saw in Tolkien or C.S. Lewis or even the more modern J.K. Rowling. And though I knew that there was an answer to these criticisms, I never had the language to express that until my 3rd year of college when I read Tolkien's essay on the subject called On Fairy Stories. Now this essay is a theoretical framework for the literary genre of fantasy. Tolkien examines fantasy's origins and engages its critics and ultimately lays down that fantasy, precisely through its characteristic dissimilarity to what he calls the primary world or the reality around this, precisely through this thing that usually lets it get criticized, it has 3 unique abilities. It has 3 unique offerings. It can offer escape, it can offer recovery, and it can offer consolation. And Tolkien believes that fantasy uses these abilities to lead its readers deeper into reality rather than farther outside of it. And so my thesis statement is this, that J.R.R. Tolkien's theoretical framework, laid out in the essay On Fairy Stories and applied in his epic The Lord of the Rings, shows how fantasy, through its characteristic and creative dissimilarity to the primary world, is a genre uniquely and especially suited to lead its readers to a recovery of joy, and thus it has the potential to spread a message of hope. Now, to begin unpacking this thesis statement and help begin the discussion, I have to make you understand what fantasy is, and more precisely, what fantasy is in Tolkien's framework. For Tolkien, fantasy, at its most basic level, is subcreation. What does that mean? What is subcreation? Well, Tolkien viewed reality as having the essential quality of being created by God. Reality is God's creation. It is the most primary creation. It is primary art, the first and greatest art. So God creates primary art. Now, humanity, created in the image and likeness of a God who is a creator, a maker, also has a creative faculty, also has a creative capacity. And when we use this creative capacity, Tolkien says that we produce what he calls subcreation, or a secondary art. So man subcreates secondary art. Man produces subcreation, and God produces creation. God creates primary art. Man subcreates secondary art. And it's important to note that for Tolkien, this subcreation, this secondary art, achieves its highest form when it's given the inner consistency of reality. When our creative expressions are given the inner consistency of reality. Just hold on to that for a moment while I explore a necessary part of the creative process, which is the faculty of imagination. Now, imagination at its most simple is the mental ability to create pictures in our heads of things that aren't present before us. For example, I can imagine myself in my bed tonight, completely stress-free because my capstone's done and over with. However, a necessary ability of imagination is the ability to invent things that don't exist in the primary world, to create mental images of things that don't actually exist. For example, I can look up at the sun, the yellow sun, and say, what if it were green? And I can hold that image of the green sun in my mind, and then using the words, the green sun, I can communicate that image to you, the image of a green sun, which doesn't actually exist in the primary world. Nobody's ever been able to see it, but you can create the image of it. You can invent it. And these inventions are expressed through language. So fantasy, at another level, is the act of wondrous invention. The act of inventing things that don't exist in reality, in what Tolkien calls the primary world, and then expressing that invention through language. Now, the critics at this point might say that I'm proving their point. That fantasy thrives on pretend and make-believe, and on departing from our reality, and thus it has no benefit. There's no truth in it. There's no reality. It's all pretend and childish make-believe. But for Tolkien, this departure is not only precisely the point and object of fantasy, but its greatest strength. Remember that I said that Tolkien believes that subcreations are the result of providing our expressions, our creative expressions, with the inner consistency of reality. So when I tell you a story, if that story is consistent with itself and it seems real, then it's really easy for you to believe that it might have actually happened. Or at least that it's a good story because it's consistent with itself. But when I introduce fantastic objects into that story, it becomes a lot more difficult for you to believe. It becomes a lot more difficult to make real to you. I can tell you a story about a lizard that I found in my room the other day, but as soon as I tell you that that lizard is actually 40 feet long, has wings, and can breathe fire, then it's a lot harder for me to make that story real to you, to make that dragon, as it were, real to you. And so the more fantastic an object is, the harder it is to make real. But for Tolkien, this is a virtue rather than a vice. Listen to the following quote from Tolkien's essay. Anyone inheriting the fantastic device of human language can say the green sun, but that is not enough. To make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible, commanding secondary belief, will certainly demand a special skill, and few attempt such difficult tasks. But when they are attempted and in any degree accomplished, then we have a rare achievement of art, indeed narrative art, story-making in its most primary and potent mode. You see, for Tolkien, this difficulty is not a reason that fantasy should not be attempted, because this difficulty yields a great fruit. It yields story-making in its most primary and potent mode. It yields our greatest ability to create. You see, fantasy doesn't thrive on tricking its readers into believing that the world around us, the primary world, is different than it actually is. Instead, it invites us into another world altogether, another reality, as it were, a sub-created reality. It tells us not that the sun is actually green and that we've been wrong our whole lives, but that here's another world where there is a green sun, and here's all the effects of that. Come explore this world. And when we start to explore that world, when we're invited in by the author, and we're in that world, and we find it to be true to itself, we find that it's consistent with its own laws and rules, then it becomes true from us, and we're able to believe in that world while we're inside of it. We're able to have a full experience of that secondary reality without being jarred out of it. And this is what Tolkien calls secondary belief. And this is the highest aim of all fantasy, even of all sub-creation, to sub-create another world in the image and likeness of God. And so primarily, fantasy is the attempt to create a living, realized sub-creative art, to create an entire secondary world, a sub-created reality that is different and derived from reality, but is no less true than reality. Again, the critics might say at this point, what is the point of sub-creating another reality? So what? We can create other worlds. We can create other realities. We might even be able to make those fantastic realities believable, and we might have a sense of wonder. But what's the point in that? What can we learn from those realities that we can't learn from the cold, hard reality around us? Well, Tolkien believes that there are three benefits. Again, the three things I mentioned in the introduction: escape, recovery, and consolation. And we will begin by talking about escape. And to begin this discussion of escape, I offer the following quote from Tolkien. "Why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in a prison, he tries to get out and go home?" You see, Tolkien believes that there's a confusion of terms that's involved in one of the most common criticisms levied against the fantasy genre, that it's escapism, that it involves a running away from reality. He believes that when discussing the negative effects of escapism, people are confusing the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter. The deserter is a coward because he or she is fleeing from their duty, running away from the task assigned to him simply because it is too hard. And in doing so, they usually let people down. It's an abandonment. The prisoner, on the other hand, is trapped. The prisoner is trapped in a situation that they have no ability to actually remove themselves from. It's beyond their power to escape this cage, whether it's literal or figurative, whether it's an actual jail cell or an abusive relationship, for example. And who would fault such a prisoner if they are able to escape the harshness of their reality for a while through a book? It's important to note that all fiction, all literature even, is capable of providing this escape. All literature allows us, in a sense, to enter other minds, to enter other situations and scenarios and contexts. But fantasy is able to do it to a primary degree because of its sub-creative nature, because it offers an entirely new reality to escape into. And Tolkien believes that these sub-created realities might actually deal with more reality than the real world around us. How is this possible? How could anything be more real than reality? Well, Tolkien believes that everyday life has been distanced from fundamental things. He believes that the modern and industrial age has offered us a great many benefits, but it's also given us a kind of protection. It gives us distractions from certain things that scare us, but that might actually be good for us, such as the transcendental, the mysterious, the unknown, those things we can't quite get a grasp on. Fantasy has the unique ability to escape these distractions, to escape these boundaries, and explore those fundamental and possibly even transcendental things. Listen to the quote from Tolkien's essay. "Much that intellectuals would call serious literature is no more than play under a glass roof by the side of a municipal swimming bath. Fairy stories or fantasy stories may invent monsters that fly the air or dwell in the deep, but at least they do not try to escape from heaven or the sea." You see, Tolkien believes that the literature of his time, he's writing this in around like the 30s, played it safe. That it might have been good, but it didn't acknowledge these certain truths and mysteries that we're afraid of. It substituted what he called the legendary dome of heaven for glass roof, the glass roof of a train station, for example, which offers all the beauty, but none of the vastness, none of the actual mystery of what's up there. And he believes that we've substituted the vast ocean, the terrible beauty of the unknown sea, with a municipal swimming bath, a controlled, contained environment. See, fantasy is an escape into reality rather than from it. It is able to dive right down into the depths of the ocean or fly right up into the heavens and explore those things that we've forgotten in our own time, those things that the industrial age might distract us from, those things which might not be a part of our everyday experience anymore, but might be just as essential to our human experience as at any time ever. And so this examination of things which have become lost or forgotten or obscured by time or familiarity, and the product of that examination, which is a rediscovery or a renewal, a regaining of something, is what Tolkien calls recovery, which is fantasy's second great virtue. You see, over time as we go through life, things or concepts become familiar to us. And as they become familiar, they kind of lose their sharpness a bit. They become less distinct in our perception, and they kind of fade into the background. Take, for example, a painting. You buy a painting and you hang it in a room of your house. And at first, maybe in the first couple of days, every time you enter that room, the painting catches your eye. Because it's new, it's bright, you love it, it's beautiful, you bought it for a reason. And every time you walk in the room, it's like, that's a good painting, I'm glad I bought that painting. But after a few weeks or a few months, you go into that room and you kind of cease to see that painting altogether. It fades into the background and you don't necessarily notice it at all. It's a part of the landscape of the room and it fades into the background of your perception until one day you have a guest over and that guest says, hey, look at that painting. And suddenly you see that painting again as if for the first time. It's jarred forward into the foreground of your experience. And this is recovery. The moving of things from the background of our perception, from the trap of familiarity, into the primary mode of our sight again. And it's done through usually placing familiar things, familiar concepts, into unfamiliar contexts. And again, it's worth noting that all fiction is capable of this on a level. All fiction is able to take a familiar concept or an idea and throw it in a new scenario, throw it in a new situation, and help us to learn something about that. But fantasy is, again, able to do it to a special degree because it is able not to just throw these unfamiliar things into a new context, but an entirely new reality. And the best way to explain this in the confines of the presentation is through examining heroism. So in a typical fantasy story, you have usually ordinary characters, the heroes, exemplifying great bravery in the face of many dangers. And the bravery that these characters exemplify is often made more real to us by the exaggerated circumstances. So we see these ordinary characters, which could actually be us a lot of times, and especially in Tolkien's work, it's very ordinary people who are doing great things. We see these ordinary characters facing unimaginable horrors. And as they face these unimaginable horrors, they learn what it means to be afraid. They experience great fear and great heart-stopping terror in the face of giant spiders or weird, creepy guys on dragons, you know? And as they experience that terror, we as the reader are able to experience that terror. And then, in the midst of their terror, they stand up and they face the monster. They face the source of their fear. And as they face it and overcome it, we see what it means to be afraid of something and to act in spite of that fear. To overcome those things in our own lives, which are horrible to us. Because we can see these ordinary characters facing these immense and great dangers beyond anything that we can imagine. And we realize that if they can do it, then we can do it too. It's as if it's zooming in on the idea of bravery. We recover what it means to be a hero. We recover heroism. Now, the primary recovery that fantasy is able to make, the preeminent virtue of fantasy, is the recovery of hope. Or it might also be termed the escape from despair. It is consolation. Fantasy is able to offer consolation. Consolation, according to Tolkien, is joy beyond the walls of the world. Joy that is as poignant as grief. Joy that stems from a hope in the face of final universal defeat. So fantasy is able to offer hope in the face of final universal defeat. That's a tall order. It's a bold claim from Tolkien. And how does he justify that? Tolkien says that fantasy is able to do it through what he calls the eucatastrophe, which is literally the good catastrophe. It's the etymology. It's the sudden turn from despair to joy. It's that moment in a story where everything seems lost. Everything seems as though it will fail. All the good is about to fade. The darkness is at its deepest. You feel the despair of the characters, and you can't see anything working out. The quest is going to fail. The characters are going to die, and you almost want to close the book and walk away because you can't see how everything will work out. You don't want to see the world come crashing down around your characters' ears. And yet you keep reading, and suddenly, out of nowhere, a light shines through and breaks up the darkness. Something happens, something unexpected, something unrepeatable, something inexplicable happens that makes everything suddenly work out, that makes the darkness go away, that shines a light through, that makes the characters have success and restores goodness and truth and beauty, and you have hope in the world again, and you have hope in the face of darkness, and you have hope that things are all going to work out every time. And again, all literature does this. I can't emphasize this enough. All these powers other literature has. You know, every piece of fiction functions on, you know, the introduction of a problem and the building up of that problem and the tension and then the release that comes from the removal of that tension when the problem is resolved. But fantasy is able to do it to a special degree because it's not constrained by the limits of likelihood. It can exaggerate the despair to almost impossible circumstances. It can make your normal problem into a problem that features the fate of the world, and it can make the despairs that is faced by the ordinary characters unimaginable and terrible and horrible. And the greater the despair, the greater the tension. And the greater the tension is the greater the release that comes from the tension. And so fantasy, because of its unique ability to depart from the primary world, to remove itself from the limits of likelihood or possibility, is able to exaggerate the circumstances to such a degree that the grief and subsequent joy in any story are all the more poignant, are all the more powerful. It is able to throw you down into the depths of hell and make you experience all the pains that are associated with it. And then it is able to deliver you from that hell and throw you up into the heights of heaven. It's able to capture hell and heaven in one fell swoop. And the best way to help you guys understand this is actually a quote, a very small quote from Tolkien's own story, The Lord of the Rings. Now, I don't really have time to get into all of that now, but suffice it to say that in this situation that this quote comes up, you have the main characters are in the heart of the enemy's country. They're in a land of darkness and gloom, literal darkness and gloom, and they're near the end of their quest, but the distance remaining between them and the end is insurmountable. They see no way that they can succeed, and they have no hope, and they've literally been surrounded by darkness and gloom. And then one night, one of the main characters, Sam Gamgee, sees a star shining in the sky. And Tolkien describes the passage as thus: "The beauty of the star smote Sam's heart as he looked up out of the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach." Think about that. In the end, the shadow was only a small and passing thing, and there was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. This is the primary assurance of fantasy, that there is hope in the face of even the greatest darkness. And this is its ultimate bearing of relevance on reality. It is the ultimate answer to Tolkien's critics, this consolation that fantasy offers. And in conclusion, I want to talk a little bit about that. You know, in our world today, and really in every time from the beginning of time, there's always been reasons for despair. There's always been reasons to look at the world and despair and lose hope. In our day, you know, we face disease and poverty and crime and war and terrorism and all these things. And it's very easy to look at all of that and lose hope. And Tolkien himself profoundly knew the despair of life. He fought in World War I and saw most of his friends die beside him. He lived through the Great Depression and the Second World War. He witnessed the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he profoundly knew that despair, but he responded to it in a different way than we do today. I think that today, there seems to be a tendency to respond to preeminent despair by engaging in consumerism and hedonism, by buying things that give us pleasure, by distracting ourselves from the darkness that surrounds us. But the problem is, this doesn't fulfill, because it simply ignores the problem. Rather than dealing with the darkness ahead of us, it simply tries to tell us that darkness doesn't exist. It simply tries to ignore it. And so we are trying to distract ourselves, but eventually we have to look back at the darkness, and it seems to have grown in our mind because we spent all this time trying to get away from it, and it's just as prevalent as ever. What Tolkien says is that we have to look into the face of that darkness and realize that it exists. We have to acknowledge that darkness, that despair, but that does not mean that we have to give up hope. We can have consolation and faith that that hope will always be there, that there is always light beyond the darkness. And he says that fantasy is uniquely able to offer this assurance, to offer this consolation. Because it is able to escape from despair, because it is able to introduce despair to us and then escape from it, to deliver from it, to magnify the scope of that despair to a heart-wrenching level, and then bring us to the very heights of joy, fantasy can give us consolation. Fantasy can assure us that no matter how deep the darkness, no matter how dark the shadow, there is always light. And thus, it is worthy of our attention. It is not to be relegated to the nursery, as many people say that it should. It is for children and adults. It is for the human person, because it speaks to a fundamentally human problem, the idea that there's always reason to despair. It is the assurance, above all, that there is always hope. It tells us that no matter how dark the shadow, no matter how prevalent it is, there is always light and far beauty beyond its reach. The shadow is always a passing thing, and light will always shine through it in the end. There is hope, my brothers and sisters, and faith is fantasy is primarily able to reintroduce that hope into our lives. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. Are there any questions? Aristotle believed that drama and the experience of drama, and often Greek drama had a lot of fantastic elements, that it was able to engage our emotions. It really allowed us to experience tension and despair, and then it was able to deliver it from that. He called it a purging, I believe. So when we experience drama, it allowed us to experience the pity and fear that we normally collect in our day-to-day life, and then it delivered us from that, and it purged that from us. And this is very similar to Tolkien's notion of consolation, which is the idea that there's always going to be reasons to pity and fear, but there's always hope beyond it. And even when we forget it, fantasy is able to show us that there is hope. It literally shows us how we can enter into darkness and be free from it.
Yeah, excellent. In Plato, you remember, he talks about the imitation.
Okay.
And so that's kind of where I was going with that. The primary, secondary world, how does that correspond to Plato's notion of imitation?
Essentially, the secondary world, it's different from the primary world. It is very different from the primary world, but essentially, it is the exact same, because it's speaking of the same reality and the same truths. So when it could be said that the secondary world imitates the primary world, but the imitation isn't the true thing. The true thing is the reality and the truths and the concepts that are being recovered. And Plato criticized a lot of drama because he considered it to be mere imitation, to be not approaching reality. But Tolkien's saying something very different. He is saying that a subcreated world and imitated would very much disagree, I think, with Plato's notion, with Plato's criticism against drama, which you might also say about fantasy, that it is mere imitation and it can offer no benefit.
Nice job. One follow-up question. You kind of, I think the whole project implicitly addresses this, but how does Capstone reflect some aspect of your vocation?
well, as a potential future priest, I'm going to have to directly tackle this pessimism, this despair in the hearts of our culture, and the very fact that our culture tries to ignore that despair and tries to distract ourselves from it. Fantasy is able to offer hope, and the priest is really an agent of hope. He brings the hope of Jesus Christ into the lives of others. So I think this taught me another way of providing that hope. I think it really depends on the situation. It depends on the nature, what the person is looking for. And all people react to different things, in different ways. If a person really was struggling with seeing the reason for living and was depressed at the world around them, they turned on the news every night and there was another story about another murder, and they just couldn't handle that. And they were like, Father, I just don't understand how God is in this and how God can shine through this. I might recommend to them a story that contains the eucatastrophe, because it seems to me a primary way of introducing that concept that God is able to deliver us from the darkness, and that even in the midst of the darkness, the sun is coming up. In the darkest night, the night is darkest just before the dawn. That might be a situation, but I know several non-fantastic literary books that are just as good at doing that in certain ways, and in certain, maybe not as keenly, but in different aspects that might be more suited to the person who's asking me for a book recommendation. It really just depends on what they're looking for. I mean, it's kind of a cynical notion, and it's not having faith in faith. Really what fantasy is able to kind of recover for us, in a sense, is the idea of faith. That, the idea that when we're in darkness, that darkness for us is really complete. And, hell is hell, and we really feel that pains. But even in spite of that, we see that pain and that despair mirrored in these fantasy stories. The imitation is really disproven by, I think, in my own experience, when you read something and it resonates with you, you find something to be true. It's that secondary belief that I mentioned, that, you believe in this world because it resonates with the way you feel in our world. And when you're delivered from that very real despair, it's able to kind of ignite that faith, in a sense. And if if you refuse to believe that there is hope, if you categorically refuse and put your foot down and say there is no hope, there's never going to be any hope, this darkness is the end, then there's really nothing that can break through that. God's grace, of course, but there's nothing that nothing can break through a wall. But I think most people aren't at that point. I think most people want to believe. Most people want to believe that the darkness is temporary and that there's a light and a hope beyond it. And fantasy speaks to that part, and it brings it back to the primary, the primary part of our heart, and it gives it control again, rather than the panicky and fearing side. Actually, it's interesting, because Tolkien, in his essay, he compares this to the Greek tragedy. He says, he actually says tragedy is the true form of drama, referencing that Greek tragedy, but the eucatastrophe is the true form of the fairy tale, fairy stories. And the eucatastrophe inherently involves that increasing of despair, that intensifying, but it delivers it from it. Not all fantasy, of course, doesn't. There are some, fantasy that can just leave you hanging on that despair. There is some macabre stuff out there, dark things. It's really up to the author. Tolkien is really talking about what he believes to be, the true form of fantasy. Its ultimate height. Its very fulfilling powers. But of course he says that we are able to use these sub-creative powers in negative ways. We can, in fact, he says, produce a horror. But that does not preclude our, that should not be a reason not to use it. He says specifically that abuse does not preclude use. That this, just because some people produce horrors with fantasy does not mean that we shouldn't do it. But yes, it is very capable of intensifying that despair and then leaving you there. I mean, science fiction is, in a sense, a type of fantasy. It may deal with more recognizable things, and that's why Tolkien tends not to like it, but it is capable of the same thing because it's not constrained by any limits. It is just as free from absurd fact as fantasy is. So it's just as able to intensify that despair and then offer the supreme delivery. Not necessarily, because it goes back to what Dr. Lindsay was asking me about Aristotle. Horror can, allow us to experience that despair, and it's sometimes in experiencing that despair, it can purge it from our system. We have this fear that we go through in life, and in engaging in a horror film or a horror novel, we can kind of purge that, experience it, then be done with it and move on. So it can be a good thing sometimes, I would say. And the horror genre isn't necessarily a bad genre. Well, in the most primary way, for like someone that's someone as I would describe as a prisoner in Tolkien's sense, someone who's trapped in a reality they can't necessarily change, and it's hell. Fantasy, its first one, it can offer escape, so it can distract them from that problem. However, even if their problems may match like the problems in a fantasy world, if it's just as big and real and terrible as dangerous, it still can offer the hope of delivery. It's most effective to someone who in their everyday experience does not encounter these problems or these truths or these mysteries. But to someone who's profoundly aware of suffering, they're still able to relate to the suffering of the characters. They might even, I don't know for sure, be able to relate in a more profound way. Like someone else understands what it means to suffer this much. And that in itself gives them hope. But then in the delivery, that might just inspire them again that there is hope, that no matter how dark this pain that I'm in is, here's someone who knows about that pain just as much as I do, because they can write something that resonates with me in a profound way, and yet they have hope that you can be delivered from it. They wrote this in such a way that they are delivered from that hell. And so I am given a hope in my life that someone else has been through this and they've gotten through it. So maybe I'll get through it too. That's just one of the possible ways I could see that helping someone, for example, who's starving to death or who is in the middle of a war or something like that.